As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me. Us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
What percent of the police live in the city?
What about 5% or so?
5%, so 95% don't live in the city. So when you say that the vast majority of the percentage goes towards salaries, etc., fringe benefits, that means that they take their money on 81, go to outside the city, pay taxes in those communities that have some of the best schools while we have an underfunded school district.
$60 million.
So I just want to put into context what we're talking about, because it's really easy to say, Mayor, and with all due respect, I like you. But that was a very politician answer.
I'm sorry, what specifically?
We will consider and we will look. What we're saying is we're not interested in considering and looking. What we're saying is actually there's 50 million, commit to 20 million cut. Because we're sending money as the mayor of Syracuse. When you don't have a tax base, you're sending money out of Syracuse, and not just for 30 years, for the rest of their life. Because their pensions, their health insurance, their families. So we are funding for other people's communities to have the promise of the American dream while we are denying it in our community.
That was our guest today, Yusuf Abdul-Qadir, whose clip went viral actually, in which he spoke in a community town hall, I believe. And when I heard that and I saw that go viral, I thought to myself, this is probably one of the easiest ways to understand what we mean by reallocation of funding. Thank you for joining us, bro. So good to have you on the Malcolm Effect today.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Let's just go straight into it. What was the background to that talk?
Yeah, it's really important to put into context what that talk was, because it's really easy for people to kind of pick at it and make it mean to them what they want it to mean.
Yes.
What this was about there's a few things that this was about. First, it was about what democracy should look like, right? Often when we go to meetings with elected officials, or you go to a town hall, or you go to a community forum, or a budget hearing, or some kind of public meeting, you are provided oftentimes an opportunity to give a comment, but you don't often get a response. And we wanted to really change the dynamic, because what we were really explicit in making sure that both the elected and public officials there understood, and the broader community understood, was that they're not called public servants because we serve them. They're called public servants because they serve us. And in a moment where we're in a crisis in our country and globally, where we're beginning to really, where everyone is beginning to realize the racial fissures that exist in every society, the kind of ways that white supremacy has organized and structured every part of our lives, everything from the laws that rule us to our definitions of beauty, right? Everything in our society is structured around white, heteronormative, straight, Christian, male dominance. And everyone else in society is a fraction of that. If you're a woman, if you're a Black person, if you're a Muslim, then you are always viewed as if
as the other.
Exactly. And so it was really important for us to kind of interrogate that in this moment where we're seeing COVID-19 devastating Black and brown communities specifically, when we're seeing, and as we were seeing throughout the summer, the continued police state-sanctioned violence against Black bodies and the deaths at Black bodies at the hands of those who are supposed to quote unquote protect and serve, that it was really important for us to say that we're not going to accept this any longer. And it wasn't even a public forum that was scheduled. We actually said that we want to have a meeting with our elected officials, and that we weren't going to have a meeting traditionally behind closed doors, that we wanted the entire community and what wound up happening, the world, to see what democracy should look like. That when an issue of importance is raised, that your elected and public officials ought to respond to it, and they have a responsibility. So that's the first part of what that video is about. It's also,
before just cut you off, I'm going to ask a very superficial quick question first, and then we're going to pack it and hopefully get to some more depth. The first question is, what's it like to go viral?
Honestly, I did not plan. None of us planned for that video to go viral. We knew its importance. It's pretty cool. I mean, because you see the people who retweet it or share it, and it's gone, I think, to like over 12 million now. But it also is humbling because it makes you realize that you're in this work, and it's important and it matters, and it's important not just for me, but really for all the people whose labor went into making that event happen, and who gave voice to a movement in a moment that is so important in our country and as well as world history. So it's pretty
Absolutely.
exciting.
Okay, no, absolutely. And I think that's one of the most, literally one of the most strongest cases I've made, in such plain terms, but what is meant by reallocation of funds. Okay, so you kind of prefaced the beginning of what your response to me with by saying it means different things to different people. So am I correct in my understanding that that clip was about defunding the police and what it means?
Absolutely. It is absolutely about defunding the police, especially because in New York State and in the US generally, but especially in New York State, the way that we fund communities like schools is through property taxes, right? And
Okay.
when you live in a home and you buy a home, you pay a property tax, and that money goes towards funding the schools. And unfortunately, in the city of Syracuse, we are one of the most impoverished communities in the country. We have the highest concentration of poverty amongst Blacks and Latinos in the United States. We're the ninth most segregated county in the country. We have the most underfunded school district in the state of New York. We have some serious
Wow.
challenges. And 95% of our police force do not live in the city that they police. And it's not just
Wow.
about making sure police live in the communities that they serve. That's important. It's not just because of the race of the police are largely white, like 92% of the police force is white in a city that's mostly of color. It's not just
Wow.
that, right? Because I think people want to say, well, we just need more Black cops, or we need to make sure that the police live in the communities that they serve. It's about the institution of policing itself. And why we call for defunding the police is because if you look at the institution, it's going to always bear the same fruit, right?
Yep.
The institution in the US is born out of maintaining slavery. It's
Yep.
born out of furthering Jim Crow. It's when you see the images of John Lewis, a famed, now recently died civil rights activist, giant, a legend,
Yep.
who fought for voting rights in the US, and you see him crossing the M. Pettus Bridge, and you see the
Yep.
images of the people that are attacking them, those are police. And that's in the history of policing in the US. And so, in a moment where we're seeing the excessive deaths of Black and Brown people from policing, it's easy for people to say, we need to provide better training. It's easy for
Yeah.
people to say, we need to do community policing. It's easy for people to say we have to diversify the force. What isn't easy to do is to talk about the ecosystem that plagues Black and Brown lives, that create the
So
realities that we see in our communities today.
So essentially, are you for reform or are you saying you're an abolitionist?
So personally, and I struggle with this, and I'm being transparent, I believe in building towards abolition. And as
Okay.
Malcolm would say, by any means necessary. And
Okay.
sometimes that means taking measures that are reform measures, right?
Yeah.
Like, because there are things that have to happen today, right? And also there
Absolutely.
are things that need to be transformative. You know, Malcolm is known for saying that if you put a 9-inch blade in my back and you remove it 6 inches, I still have the blade in my back, right?
Yes.
That's progress to some people. That's not progress, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
the wound is still there, and even removing the blade
Yeah.
as you continue is not progress, right? You actually have to heal the harm that you caused. Well, we can't
Mm.
actually get to a place of healing the harm that was caused if we keep funding the things that create the harm. And that's why
Well,
I'm
then,
very much
let,
committed
break,
towards defunding and abolition.
Okay, so let's break it down because we hear these terms a lot, and we hear a lot of people have used these as, people want lawlessness and people want, to just you hear the kind of right wing commentators or let prisoners and so not prisoners, like rapists and pedophiles, all these things. Yeah. So break it down in the simplest terms. What is meant by defunding the police? And then what is meant is when we talk about a world without quote unquote normative policing as we know it.
Yeah, I think it's important to do that. And I think what that clip does is talk about the way that we fund certain parts of our lives, like
Mm-hmm.
making sure that communities are over policed, that they are oversaturated with language, equipment, technologies of war deployed after their occupied territories with an occupying force. This
Mm-hmm.
warrior cop mentality, this war on crime, war on drugs, war on terror approach to dealing with
Yeah.
really essential issues of poverty. And what
Yes.
defunding the police is about is saying that a police officer should not show up to a mental health crisis. Because when that happens, what we see is, especially when they're Black people or brown people, that can result in that individual's death. That policing as an institution is born out of ensuring social structures that dehumanize, criminalize, and impoverish Black people. And that if we want to stop seeing the types of outcomes that we have in these communities, we cannot continue to fund the things that create these outcomes. If we funded schools and mental health programs and nutrition programs and after school programs and the types of quality of life concerns that are really plaguing these communities, as opposed to continuously charging them with crimes and incarcerating them, we'd have different outcomes. And that's really what defunding the police ought to be about.
Okay, and then if we can go a little bit into abolition, then what does the world look like without quote unquote normative policing as we know it today?
And as I said, I struggle with this, right? Because my brother, I grew up in the Bronx, and a moment when in the late 80s, 90s, my brother and many people died of drive-by shootings. It was rampant in New York City at the time. And so I intimately understand, and my mother intimately understands what it's like to have a loved one lost to gun violence. And a part of why our approach has been incremental transformative was because we recognized that there are mothers who live in a neighborhood where their son was killed. And we don't want to be insensitive to those mothers. But what I would ask your listeners to do is to, for a moment, close their eyes and imagine what a safe community looks like. I would reckon that you would think that you would see trees and birds, and you would see kids playing, and you would see vitality and livelihood. You would see a grandmother rocking chair and crocheting, or you would see activity, you would see liveliness. What you wouldn't see in your definition of safety is someone being put in a cop car. What you wouldn't see is someone being thrown against a wall and patted down. What you wouldn't see is someone being chased and shot at by a police officer. So why is it that whenever we look at creating policies around safety, that's all that we fund?
Exactly.
We don't
I
fund
mean,
the things that give us that vitality.
exactly. So essentially what we're saying is I think people quite deceptively equate abolition with kind of like lawlessness and, nihilism and these kind of things. And I think, no, it's just saying ultimately we're looking at a new approach in how we ensure law and order in a way that hasn't been done before. Because clearly, I mean, just to give some context, UK context, for example, we have I don't know if you're aware of our Home Secretary. Her name is
Yeah.
Priti Patel.
Yep.
So she is like, this hard law and order. And just for funny, I don't know if you saw recently, they asked several of the party leaders and ministers in government and opposition, what got you through 2020? And people were saying, being able to read more books or being able to spend more time with my family or being able to support, and this Priti Patel, to give a context of what she's like, she said that what got me through 2020 was knowing that, criminals and perpetrators have no safe refuge in our streets and going on raids with police officers in the early hours of the morning. And I thought, wow, okay. Everyone has their own kicks, I guess. Everyone has their own kicks, I guess. But, she's been very tough on crime. She's vowed to put 30,000 more officers on the street. But the question I put to people and to listeners is that from 1985 until 2020, we have consecutively increased the budgeting for policing in the UK, and we've consecutively increased police officers. That has not resulted in any material kind of depreciation or material decrease in crime. So what does that say? That says the way we're doing policing is by design not set up to decrease crime levels. And in fact, all it does is make more quote unquote criminals.
Yeah, I mean,
So,
I could not agree with you even more. Everything you said both resonates and really gets at like the histories behind these things, because the idea of what's law and order is baked in social Darwinist theory, right? This eugenics types of theory where people are prone to criminality, and because they're prone to criminality, we have to continue to monitor, surveil, and incarcerate them because they're not worthy of being in society. And I think
literally,
the racial undertones of that are often misunderstood and underappreciated. But more importantly, to your point, we're not actually funding the things that we know work, right? Like we know that like when kids are in school and graduate, that they're more likely to be successful. We know that when people don't have to, live on small budgets and aren't like starving, that like the crime rate goes down. And I don't want to give the sense that poor people are prone to criminality, because that's also something that also happens. But the way that we police poor and Black and brown communities versus wealthier white suburban communities is very different.
Yep.
like wealthiest.
And
I went to, and I lived in London, by the way. I studied abroad in London, but I lived
okay.
in central London. And I remember, I lived in a very nice area of Russell Square. I didn't have the
Oh,
same
you
types of,
bougie.
my university is quite bougie. And so it was a nice area, and I didn't have any worries or concern. And I remember going to East London, and I felt comfortable in East London. I had no
Yeah,
issues at all in East London.
that's where I grew up.
Whitechapel, yeah, so Whitechapel area is where I
Yeah.
was, and I noticed there was an increasing police presence at the time, and
Mm-hmm.
it bothered me because there was more drug use and illicit behavior in
Absolutely.
Russell Square than there was in East London, but the types of response from law enforcement was very different. And it just
Absolutely.
goes to show that it's not about quote unquote safety, it's always about order and social order, which again goes to the eugenics racist history of who is violent and virulent and
Exactly.
criminal and animalistic. And that's to me the crux of these issues. So when I hear Priti Patel and others talk in that kind of tone, it's very difficult for me not to kind of cringe for a moment, because what they're saying is that we should justify the ways that we are devastating people's lives. And that's not okay.
Literally, literally. And I feel like if we take the example of the UK and a public health approach, I mean, again, to echoing what you said, we are not focusing on the things that work. I mean, Akala has debunked the black on black crime in probably one of the most strongest, ways in how he kind of debunks it. But he says that Scotland had an issue with crime, with quote unquote, young black people or young people or particularly demographic from particular socioeconomic background involved in violent crime. They took a public health approach, and what happened? We saw significant decrease in levels of crime, of violent crime between young people. So we've seen a model that works just down, across the way from England. But the British government, sorry, the English government does not want to use the same approach. For what reason? I mean, again, not to be a kind of, a conspiracy theorist or, a cynic, but it's almost as if they want certain demographics to be criminalized and made into criminals. One can't
I,
help but think that.
I am not a conspiratorial thinker either, but I think that when we look at the history and we look at the ways that we have developed the laws, that has been the intention. And in the U.S.
Absolutely.
context, after the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, except when a person's convicted of a crime, as the 13th Amendment to the Constitution goes, what wound up happening is a creation of a whole series of laws that criminalized behavior that only Black people did, so that you could put them
Hmm.
back into slavery. So it's not conspiratorial, because when you actually look at the historical record, you can actually see that there were laws that were created explicitly and exclusively to structure social order of Black people and brown people in ways
Yep.
that are very different than white people. It's not conspiratorial.
Absolutely. I want everyone just take a minute. Everyone just take a second, a few seconds. Can we just like reflect and deep what Yusuf said? He said that the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, they had to have an amendment in the United States to recognize the humanity of Black people. Can we just think about that for a second? I think people overlook that the Black people's humanity wasn't a given in the United States of America. It was something that had to be legislated and then amended upon on top of that. I always find that quite, mind-boggling when I just to even to kind of contemplate over. But yeah,
Well,
as you said, the point.
and
Yeah,
then the
so Karen.
14th and then the 14th Amendment made us citizens, right? So it's not just the 13th
See?
Amendment that ended slavery. It's like then the 14th Amendment had to say like anyone born in the US is now a citizen, right? So like it had to be, if it wasn't clear before that slavery is done and that these are human beings, well, also to be clear, they're also citizens, right? And so, and what that means in a legal sense is that they are afforded protection, right? Because
Yes.
when you are a citizen, you have certain rights that are inherent in your citizenship, right?
Yeah.
That if you're not a citizen, you may not also have. If you're a permanent resident, if you are a refugee, you may not have the same type of rights that you are
Yep.
afforded and protections, right? So that's the thing, that like it had to be explicit. And then on top of that, we had to have civil rights, right? Because it wasn't
Yep.
enough that the Constitution said that we had, and we're still not there, right? So
Exactly.
it is absurd, to your point.
Absolutely. And just to kind of backtrack to your point of Russell Square and your the kind of difference between Russell Square and East London, I always say, and many people have brought this up as well, I believe Akala mentions it a few times, that if you were to police, let's say Glastonbury, which is particularly, an indie kind of, majority of people who go there are, white. If you were to, police Glastonbury the same way you probably, policed inner city, quote unquote, inner city festivals, I guarantee you'll find more drugs in Glastonbury and more Class A drugs as well. I guarantee it. I guarantee it. But it's not.
Yeah.
Again, certain communities are not policed in the same way that Black and brown communities are. Okay, you
Not
as
at all.
someone as an activist who's on the street, who's kind of involved in this work, what's your response to people who say defunding the police as a slogan is detrimental to the cause?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it doesn't matter what you would have called it, that it would have been,
Mm-hmm.
people would have had that same perspective. And I think actually what it has done is spark a conversation that otherwise didn't
Mm-hmm.
exist. So I really resent and push back at people who say that, because it's not a slogan. It's not a tagline. It's a policy position. It's pretty explicit what it is. The policy
Mm-hmm.
position is defund the police. That's the explicit thing. And the reason why people are calling for that is because after decades of quote unquote reform and decades of training and decades of tough on crime tactics, you can't reform this. Like, you can't change this. You can't, what you have to do is defund it, because what it's doing is taking money. And that's again what that quote is about. In a city like Syracuse that is significantly poor, we as the
Mm-hmm.
poor people are funding for other communities to be wealthy, so they can then come and put us in jail. That's the absurdity of it. That's the way that this system has manifested itself after decades and generations. And so, yeah, we absolutely ought to be taking money out of putting people in jail and putting money into people's pockets, putting money into putting food on people's tables, putting money into schools, putting money into healthcare and treatment and,
Mm-hmm.
and rehabilitation, putting money into essential human services that gives people the best shot at having a decent life. And when you do that, it actually works.
And it's tried and tested.
Yeah, it is. I mean,
Tried
there's
and tested.
plenty of examples around this.
Absolutely. Can I just ask you now then? Okay, let's talk about what it was like living under Trump's America. Has this made those causes ever so much more difficult? And do you have any faith in a Biden presidency?
So, America is America, and Trump, I think it's easier for people to say that he was a blip. Trump is the manifestation of everything that was America in the most
Mm-hmm.
crudest sense, right? In the bravado, in the arrogance, in the most negative attributes of us. And it's kind of interesting, right? That like you have Obama, who is like cool and reasonable and smart and intellectual and black and suave and cultured and worldly, right? So there's that America. And then there's also the like brash, abrasive, rude, disrespectful America. And what both of
Yeah.
them demonstrate is that both of these are America, because effectively we are a country that's 50% Trump and 50% Obama.
Yeah.
And we have to reckon with that. And so living under Trump as a black person, and as a black person who's Muslim, whose wife was born in Bangladesh, right?
Yeah.
Like, it was not a good time. But to be honest with you, it's not something that I think that I was surprised with, because as
Okay.
black people, like, we know America. I think for a lot of people, they had a Hollywood version of America that
Okay.
they had to reckon with. But this is not, I am not surprised with the America that produced Trump, because that
Mm-hmm.
America has been in and with America since the Civil War. And it never died. It just was quieted. It put on a nice suit. It put on a nice tie. It spoke a nice language. But the same
It's still
policies were
it's still an
enacted under
empire.
Nixon. Exactly.
It's still an empire. No matter how you look at it, no matter who's at the head of the empire, it's still an empire. At the end of the day, an empire has, ambitions of, expanding and control and dominance. So it's still an empire, no matter who's the head, no matter who is the face of the empire. You can have a cool face, as you said, Obama, and you can have the brash face that we had in Trump. However, I'm gonna not push back, I'm just gonna interrogate that. On
Yeah.
Obama, then, let's not forget that under Obama, Black Lives Matter emerged under a black president and under a black attorney general. Yeah? So I
Yep.
want to ask you then, when it comes to Obama, someone who's a president, I think you saw him recently kind of talk down about defund the police and say it's just a snappy slogan. And, if you want to get actual work done, and Obama, he is the quote unquote ideal neoliberal centrist. Cares a lot about his legacy, tries to build the bridges between people and get things done. As someone who's involved in work and activism and wanting to achieve tangible results, do you think it's about being radical? And about being radical and organizing in a radical way, or is it about the Obama approach in that build coalitions of people, reach out to people on the right and center right, and not be so brash in your approach?
Yeah, I mean, again, I go back to, Malcolm's by any means necessary, right? I think people come to that phrase to mean many different things. I think it means what it means, by any means necessary. If the means that are necessary are the moderated approach, then those are the means that are necessary. I think we're at a
Okay.
moment, and in fact, in our organizing work, 2 years ago when we started our coalition, because this is not a new coalition, it's been doing work for 2+ years, now going on 3 years. We actually talked about abolition in the first phases of our work. And we
Wow.
talked about defunding police 3 years ago. And we said
Wow.
then strategically and tactically that we are not there yet. We have to
Wow.
actually build to getting there. And the reason why we
Mhm.
were able to say what we said that day is because we built enough successive work and built power so that at that moment, that was the only solution that we could do, because we actually tried everything. We tried to
Mhm.
work with you. We tried to litigate you. We tried to create policies. We tried to have forums. We tried everything, and it doesn't work. And that's why we now have to take a radical shift. And it's only
Mm.
quote unquote radical because of how few we have come to. And I think that's the part
Absolutely.
about quote unquote radical approaches that people don't understand. It's only radical because we have actually gone so radically off where we should be that in order to get us to a
Absolutely.
decent place, that we have to be radical. We have to take a radical shift. So yeah, I do think sometimes the Obama approach works. Sometimes you need to take a more radical approach. I think you should, as a strategist, as an organizer, you should not take anything off the table. All of those approaches
Absolutely.
should be on the table.
And I think it's very, I don't know, I think it's very telling or very, there's a misunderstanding taking place here. The activists are not politicians unless they get into elective, unless they become elected, for example, like Cory Bush, for
Hmm.
example. But the activists, the job of the activist is to put pressure on the elected official. It's to
Exactly.
put pressure and to move them into positions. I guarantee the fund the police was not like, it's become a global thing right now. Abolition work is not new. Abolition
No,
literature is not new. But now it's globally speaking, so it's reached the UK. We're talking about reimagining law and order. And this is the work of activism. Now, politicians have the role of taking that energy and translating it and, kind of translating it into policy. And I think people misunderstand the roles. It's not the job of the activist or the person in the street to kind of conform to some kind of respectability politics, in my opinion,
not at
anyway.
all. It's not. It's our job to push you, our job to
Yeah.
hold you accountable, our job to push the envelope, our job to imagine the future and to bring it to fruition and to demand that it happen.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So my question then, do you have any hope in the Biden presidency?
I do. I don't think
Okay.
that so there's a few things, right? First, I actually live next door to where Biden lived when he went to Syracuse for law school. So that's
Okay.
funny kind of history. Um, and I live in the place where he went to law school and where his sons were born, where his wife was from.
Wow.
So, we have a lot of attachment to Biden being from Syracuse University and being a student at Syracuse University and a graduate of Syracuse University. But there are specific concrete things that he can do that are important for Black people's lives, right? So
Absolutely.
while I also want something more ambitious, there's also the urgency of stopping the bleeding that he can do. Things
Okay.
like ending the Muslim ban, right? Like he can end
Hmm.
that. Things like
Yeah.
ending the child separation policy. He can end that. Things like
Hmm.
addressing climate change and rejoining the Paris Agreement. He can do that. Things like the Supreme Court and stopping the conservatives from adding more people to the court, right?
Hmm.
There are concrete specific things that affect Black people's lives now that just
Hmm.
having him there, we're in a better place. But it
Okay.
doesn't
Okay.
mean that the work stops. It's actually our job to push him. It's our job to implore him to be the ambitious president that he ought to be. People
Hmm.
look at Biden, and to me, I think of LBJ, right? And it's actually quite similar the way that, like, you had Obama being the kind of cool cosmopolitan avant-garde future president, like a
Yeah.
JFK was at the time, right?
Yeah.
And JFK's vice president being LBJ.
Yeah.
LBJ, this kind of creature of the Senate who'd been in the Senate for decades, but LBJ is who got the civil rights laws into effect. The civil rights laws
Mm.
were not the same civil rights laws that LBJ was going to do, though, right? The
Yeah.
Voting Rights Act that we got was the Voting Rights Act because organizers demanded it to be stronger.
Yeah.
The Fair
Yeah.
Housing Act is there because people protested to make it happen. And
Exactly.
LBJ, being a creature of the Senate, was able to manipulate the skill and craft of legislation to make it happen. but it was
Mm-hmm.
the kind of convergence between organizers demanding change, a really effective deal maker in LBJ to make it happen, and
Yeah,
those two things coming together that made us have the various civil rights acts that we have. So yes, as a
absolutely.
student of history, I think there's hope to be had, but it's not going to just be because he's president. We got to
I think
push
that's
him like we would
yeah.
push anyone.
I think essentially what you're saying is that just because we're Biden in office, it doesn't mean we take our foot off the pedal, basically, foot off the gas, our feet off the
Absolutely
gas.
not. We actually push the pedals even harder.
Exactly. And finally, I'm going to ask you on your bio on Instagram, sorry, on Twitter, it says Afrofuturist. Can you explain what that
Yeah.
is?
Afrofuturist, I am constantly thinking about the futures of Black people.
Mm-hmm.
And, people think about an ideal future for Black people. And one of the kind of Afrofuturist images is Wakanda, right? And everyone was like, Wakanda forever.
Yeah.
But the way that the climate crisis, the way that environmental degradation, the way that racial injustice, the way that kind of information technology and constant surveillance all affect Black people, what would a
Yeah.
future be like for Black people when we think about centering Blackness in the solutions to those problems, in the solutions
Mm-hmm.
to technology, in the solutions to climate, in the solutions to environmental degradation, in the solutions to racism? And for me, as I'm constantly thinking about the futures of Black people, I'm thinking about the way that our technology has spawned in such ways to present so many opportunities for improving the lives of Black people. And by
Mm-hmm.
leveraging the climate crisis and the opportunities that that crisis can create by centering Blackness is what I think about as an Afrofuturist.
Just unpack
So I
that a
think
bit more. What do
about
you mean by centering blackness?
yeah, so really, I think about the way that facial recognition technology, for instance, is weaponized in a way that's biased against Black people. And by
Yep.
saying in centering Blackness that we reject any technologies being developed, that in fact, technology
Mm-hmm.
should be created to advance human civilization. And if the most marginalized are Black people, then if we center Blackness and Black people as not just an afterthought or as a kind of conciliatory left of the crumbs to the pie, but as like
Yeah.
if we address the issues that affect Black people's lives in the design of technologies and in the design to the climate crisis and the solutions that should be emerging out of it, that actually
Yeah.
everyone benefits. And to be even more
Mm.
explicit, by going back to thinking about how we can regenerate Africa as a continent, how we can make sure that environmental stewardship, protecting climate and people's ability to thrive in climate, and leveraging the tools that innovative technologies have to creating a renaissance for Black people.
Mm.
It's really what I'm often thinking about. And whether it's Black people on the continent, Black people in the diaspora in the US, the UK, in Europe, in Latin America, and beyond, that is what I'm passionate and intimately and constantly thinking about.
A black renaissance. That's what I'm here for. That's what I'm
Yes.
here for. Thank you so much, bro. I'm gonna
Thank
post
you for having
Yusuf's
me.
socials in the comments in the description of this episode. I can't wait for you lot to hear this. Again, this has been an absolutely awesome episode, man. One of my favorites, actually. Guys, you are
Thank
listening to
you.
the Malcolm Effect with Mamadou. Please like, comment, subscribe, whether you're listening to an Apple podcast, Spotify, or YouTube. And until next time, take care.